Imagine a normal day, a sunny morning, quiet streets, everything as usual, but suddenly everything changes. At an intersection, right before your eyes, two police officers approach an elderly woman with a disability. Her hands are shaking. She tries to explain, but her words are drowned out by harsh, hateful commands. And then, out of nowhere, one of the officers pushes her to the ground. Imagine this moment, the asphalt, the screams, the humiliation. But these police officers had no idea that their victim was the mother of a man they would rather never meet. And now, at this very moment, when she lies on the cold ground, exhausted from pain and fear, the worst begins. Those who dared to raise a hand against her do not even guess what nightmare is approaching them. This nightmare is her son, a man whom no one wants to cross. Everything that happens next will turn their lives into a living hell. Before we continue this incredible story, I want to take a break and address you, dear viewers. Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. You are incredibly important to us. Your views and your comments help us promote this channel and tell such important stories. We are truly grateful to each of you. Your support is what makes our channel stronger. We really appreciate each of you, because together we raise important issues that cannot be ignored. Share this video so that everyone knows the truth, and let's make our world a fairer place together. Enjoy watching. An elderly disabled woman moved slowly along the sidewalk, holding onto her old cane. Her breathing was ragged, and each step was difficult. She knew the walk to the store was short, but today it seemed to stretch on forever. The sun was blinding, and she squinted slightly as she approached the doors. There was no sign of trouble. She just wanted to buy some bread and milk. A routine purchase, nothing more. But as soon as she entered the store, she felt someone's heavy gaze on her. Two police officers standing at the exit exchanged glances. Noticing her, she tried to ignore them, continuing her way to the grocery shelf, but their tense figures began to move in her direction. They walked slowly, cautiously, as if she already had a trail of crimes behind her. Her hands began to shake more violently as she took the milk carton. At that moment, one of the policemen shouted loudly, "Hey, you, come here!" Her heart sank. She looked back and their eyes met. The officers were unyielding, their faces a mixture of distrust and contempt. She couldn't understand what was happening, but every step they took towards her filled her with cold fear. She said quietly, I didn't do anything." But her voice was lost in the air. One of the policemen sped up and was at her side in seconds. His hand grabbed her shoulder sharply. "Show me your bag. Where did you hide the stolen goods?" His voice was full of malice. She froze in fear, her cane almost falling out of her hands. Stolen? She couldn't believe her ears. "You're wrong," she tried to say, but the officers weren't listening anymore. They didn't see a woman in need of help. To them, she was just another suspect. The officers surrounded the woman from both sides, like predators who had cornered their prey. One of them crossed his arms over his chest and leaned toward her face with a sneer. His eyes were blazing with anger, and his voice was full of sarcasm. "You think you can just go shopping like that?" His words sounded cold and mocking. "People like you are always stealing something. We always find you in places like this. Do you even realize that you are a burden to society?" She looked at him, shocked by his cruelty. Tears treacherously welled up in her eyes, but she tried with all her might not to cry. She tried to be strong, although her whole body was shaking with fear. "Please." "I didn't do anything," she whispered. But her words were drowned in their rude laughter. The other officer stepped closer, even more menacing and stern. His gaze slid over her clothes, a look of contempt never leaving his face. "A burden on society," he repeated, wetting his lips and twisting his mouth into a malicious grin. "You live on benefits your whole life, doing nothing but dragging us down. Your disability, it's just an excuse. We've seen people like you. You just don't want to work." Tears were now streaming down her cheeks, but she couldn't stop them. The officers wouldn't leave her alone. Each of them seemed to enjoy this humiliation, their harsh words piercing her like needles. "I just wanted to buy some food," she tried to explain again, feeling her voice tremble. "Food?" The first officer spat contemptuously on the ground next to her foot. "You're already living at our expense, aren't you? Isn't free handouts enough for you?" They continued to mock her, resorting to outright racial slurs, discussing her ethnicity as if her human dignity did not exist. One of them made a derogatory remark about her broken background, adding with disdain, "People like you are just trash." We don't pay for people like you. You're worth nothing here." Her world, which had once been so simple and clear, had collapsed around her. She stood before them, helpless, old and broken, and they acted as if this was not a woman but some object that could be humiliated and destroyed. The woman tried to speak again, her voice quiet, full of despair and fear. "Please. I just wanted to buy some food. I didn't take anything." Her words sounded muffled, her hands were shaking, she was convulsively squeezing her cane, trying to stay on her feet. But the officers wouldn't listen. One of them, clearly irritated by her attempts to justify herself, stepped toward her and roughly pulled the cane out of her hands. She screamed, her body lost its balance, and at that moment another officer, without thinking, grabbed her by the shoulder and pushed her hard to the ground. Her frail body landed with a dull thud on the cold asphalt. Her knees and elbows hit the hard surface painfully, and her head began to spin in dark spots of pain. She lay on the ground, barely understanding what had just happened. "No, please, help." Her voice trembled, almost lost in the noise of the city. She raised one hand in a gesture of supplication, hoping that one of the passers-by would intervene, but it was all in vain. No one stopped, no one approached, and the police, instead of at least paying attention to her condition, only cold-bloodedly continued their performance. "Didn't you hear? We said shut up." One of them kicked her cane to the side, so that she couldn't even try to get up. "What a pathetic picture." The second leaned towards her, mockingly. "Someone like you should have been sent to a nursing home long ago. You're no use as it is. Only trouble." She felt the cold and pain piercing her body, but the worst thing was the feeling of complete helplessness. No one heard her. Her voice had no meaning. Her pain was invisible. She could only lie there and listen to their contemptuous, hateful words. "Are you asking for help?" The officer laughed loudly. "And who will help you? People like you deserve only one thing: to be underfoot. Where you are now." He stepped forward, towering over her, his boots dangerously close to her face. He leaned in, as if he was deliberately letting her know she was worthless. In that moment, she knew they could do anything to her. No shame, no fear of punishment, no sympathy would stop them. Her voice, full of pain and humiliation, rang out again in the silence. "Help, please." But these words no longer meant anything to those who stood before her. In their eyes, she was just a helpless victim whom they could humiliate and mock without any consequences. One of the officers grabbed the woman's wrist, twisting it so hard that she couldn't help but cry out in pain. The second officer, wasting no time, leaned down and grabbed her roughly by the shoulders, forcibly pressing her to the ground. Her face met the cold asphalt with a dull thud, and she felt a warm trickle of blood begin to slowly flow down her cheek. The pain was almost unbearable, but even more terrifying was the realization that she had nowhere to run. "Didn't you hear what we said?" One of them growled, holding her hand as if it were a real threat. "Lie still, you old slut, or I'll teach you some respect." Her heart was pounding and her breathing was becoming more and more ragged. She tried to speak, tried to explain, but her words were drowned out by the dirt and mockery. She felt rough hands cuffing her wrists behind her back, twisting them so tightly that it seemed like her bones would snap. And suddenly she felt a strong pressure on her back. One of the policemen pressed his foot between her shoulder blades, pressing her even harder to the asphalt. She was suffocating. Her chest was painfully pressed to the ground, not allowing her to breathe deeply. The officer leaned over her and hissed with open contempt, "That's how it should be. You don't belong here. You're just a burden to us, a worthless creature who lives at our expense." He pressed even harder on her back, his voice turning into an angry whisper, full of hatred. "Do you think we're here to protect people like you? If it weren't for your handouts and social assistance, you would have died on the street long ago. Do you really think anyone cares about you?" Passers-by began to stop. Some of them took out their phones and began to film what was happening. Someone's voices were heard in the crowd, but the officers paid no attention to them, completely absorbed in the humiliation of their victim. "You're just trash," one of them continued, looking with hatred at her face crumpled on the asphalt. "The filth on our streets, which is long overdue to be gotten rid of. All of you, like rats, have filled our cities, and now you lie here, where you belong, under our feet." The crowd grew larger, and someone shouted, "Leave her alone," but this only made the officers even angrier. They ignored the cameras and the comments of those around them, as if they were sure that they were not in any danger. You think the cameras are going to do anything to us? One of them laughed, turning to the audience. It'll only prove that people like her deserve only one thing: to be controlled. The woman groaned softly under their weight, her face covered in dirt, tears mixing with the blood on her cheek. Her world narrowed to pain, humiliation, and fear, and the police continued to mock her and her background, as if she were beneath them in every way. The woman continued to lie on the cold asphalt, barely breathing, when one of the officers pulled the phone out of her jacket pocket. He opened the contacts and, grinning, dialed the number. His voice, full of contemptuous anger, reached his son. "Hey, you've got a problem. Your mom got caught shoplifting here at the store, and now we're teaching her the rules," he said with obvious glee, as if it were some kind of game. "She's so insignificant that she doesn't know how to approach herself." The son, hearing this, immediately became wary. An alarm flashed through his mind and he quickly grabbed his phone, trying to understand what had happened. He knew his mother. He knew that she would never do something like this, but his instincts immediately told him that things were much worse than they seemed. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice tense and sharp. "In our fine precinct," the officer replied mockingly. "We're just teaching her a little lesson. You know, people like her are just learning respect. She's always been a burden to society. And you too," he chuckled, as if it was funny. The son, feeling the anger fill his chest, forced himself to calm down. He knew he couldn't act on emotion, but his mind was already painting dark pictures. He knew who his mother was, and he knew that for those who were now humiliating her, she was just a target for their prejudice and hatred. "You have no right to treat her like that," he said, although he knew the officer would not react to his words. "She has done nothing to deserve such treatment. You better take care of yourself," he chuckled, not paying attention to the seriousness of the situation. "Don't you dare tell us how to do our job. It's an unnecessary burden, and we won't let you forget it." The son felt a cold anger wash over him. He knew he had connections that could help him resolve this situation quickly. He remembered his dark past. This was not the first showdown, but this story involved the person dearest to him. "You'll pay for this," he said, his voice calmer but with an undercurrent of menace. "I'll make sure everyone knows how you treat the elderly." The officer just laughed, and the laugh sounded eerie and hollow. "Let them. We are glad when people come to threaten us," he answered, laughing. "Let them just try to do something. It won't change anything. You and your mother are just two insignificant lives that no one will pity." The son hung up, but he knew he couldn't just let this go. He headed for the car, knowing that his mother had been mistreated simply because of her race and her weakness. He couldn't let her get any worse, and that thought filled him with determination. He didn't care what risks he took. He knew he had to act now. The woman was shoved roughly into the patrol car, her body hitting the metal door with a thud. She struggled to get up, but the officers simply grabbed her arms, pulling her roughly along. At that point, one of them laughed hoarsely, as if this was a funny performance, and leaned toward her, saying, "Don't think that anyone will come to save you. No one wants to mess with the likes of you. Only worthless creatures like you who can only beg for handouts." Another officer, also not missing the opportunity to humiliate the woman, added, "You have no idea how you look right now. A disgrace to everyone. Why did you even leave home? You're only disgracing your family. People like you shouldn't exist in society at all." The woman, trembling with fear and pain, tried to say something, but her words found no response. Instead, she could only utter a plaintive whisper, "Please, I just want to go home." Her request only provoked a new wave of ridicule. The officers, smiling at each other, began to openly misbehave. "You don't need to go home. You need to go to prison, where you belong," one of them said, pointing at her with disdain. "You'll feel right at home there, among other losers like you." In the background, someone from the passers-by shouted, "Stop, this is unfair," but the policemen only looked at each other, as if they had heard something funny. "Look, we have our own defender," one of the officers shouted back, turning to the crowd with a sneer. "Do you think anyone will stand up for her? She's just a pile of trash, and people like her should be thrown off the streets." The woman felt each derogatory word penetrate her soul, leaving scars that would never heal. She wanted to get away from it, but she physically couldn't. The patrol car closed, and she found herself trapped in their hatred. "Why are you even breathing?" one of the officers asked the woman again as he closed the door. "Get off our streets, old woman. Don't you dare show yourself to normal people again." The silence, filled with the distant sounds of the city, seemed endless. The woman sat in the back seat, her heart pounding with fear, and every time she tried to look up, she saw only contempt in the eyes of those who were supposed to protect her. Their confidence in their impunity was overwhelming, and she knew that no one would dare challenge them. The son, having reached the scene, parked the car on the side of the road and got out with a cool, collected expression. He looked at the patrol car where his mother was still sitting, pushed into the terrible conditions. A small crowd had already gathered around and there was a tense atmosphere in the air. His calmness was in contrast to the growing tension. The police, noticing his approach, did not immediately understand who he was and continued to behave arrogantly. One of the officers, laughing, addressed the crowd. "Look, another defender of this old horse. What? Have you come to protest?" The son was in no hurry to intervene. His gaze slid over the officers' faces. He saw them turn back to his mother, continuing to humiliate her. "There she is, underfoot again," one of them said, waving his arms as if it was a joke. "What do we pay taxes for? So that people like you can ruin our lives?" Another officer winked and added with a grin, "I don't think you should worry. She won't leave us anyway. She's too old and worthless for anyone to feel sorry for her. No one will want to mess with her." The son, motionless, looked at his mother in the patrol car. The tears streaming down her cheek were a stark reminder of what was happening. He knew his silence was part of the plan. He couldn't afford to give in to his emotions. "What are you going to do with her?" he finally said, his voice quiet but full of confidence. The police turned to him, puzzled. "Who are you?" asked one of the officers, looking at him with disdain. "It's none of your business. You better get up before we pin you to the ground next to her." "On what grounds did you detain her?" His question was full of invisible anger. The son was not going to back down. "She tried to steal," one of them blurted out, laughing again. "You know, people like her are always extorting something. Why is she even here? She should go to her backyard, where people like her belong." The crowd around them began to whisper, but the police seemed confident that they were in no danger. "We maintain order," the officer commented again, his voice even more hoarse with arrogance. "People like your mother only get in the way of normal people." The son felt himself boiling inside, his calmness beginning to crack at the seams. Every offensive comment about his mother lit a fire inside him. He knew that soon everything would change, and this calm appearance was just a mask for something much worse. He stepped closer to the patrol car, his eyes shining with determination. "Do you really think this will end without consequences? You're not just insulting her, you're insulting me, and this will be your last big mistake." The policemen exchanged puzzled glances, but their arrogance was still high, and one of them, still laughing, said, "Look, kid, you better back off. We know how to deal with the likes of you and your mom. Don't mess with us if you don't want trouble." But there was already a slight fear in his voice. The son was not going to back down. The son, despite the difficult situation, took action. He knew that his connections and resources could be key to fighting police brutality. That evening, he assembled a team of lawyers and activists to support his case. He knew that it was necessary not only to defend his mother's rights, but also to combat the systemic racism and bias they faced. As soon as the video of his mother's attack hit the internet, it went viral. Thousands of people began sharing it, expressing anger and outrage at what had happened. Every new message, comment, and repost added to the public pressure on the police. Soon, the video reached major news channels, and soon it became a topic of discussion on social media. The public demanded justice, and this only increased the pressure on the police. Every step taken by the police was now subject to close scrutiny. An incident with a woman who was simply trying to do some shopping took on the dimensions of a scandal. The son did not leave the police alone, covering their every move on his social media. He made posts with titles like, "How is it okay for the police to humiliate an elderly woman?" and "Why are people like her victims?" These questions resonated with thousands of people, who began to condemn the officers' actions. Meanwhile, the officers, feeling the pressure mounting, began to panic. They tried to justify themselves, but every comment they made only made the situation worse. One of them even tried to justify his actions by claiming that they had reasons for the arrest. "She looked suspicious," he said, looking at the cameras. "People like her are always up to something. Do you really think we're just going to pester her?" The crowd of people gathered outside the police station shouted back, "You are a disgrace. You behave like animals." The officers, while continuing to make their loud statements, only made their own situation worse by highlighting the bias and racism. They continued to make derogatory comments about the woman. All she knows how to do is whine. One of them chuckled again, confident of impunity. She should have been better prepared if she was going to hang around our streets. You understand, people like her only get in the way of normal people. The Sun used that hatred against them. He published every word they said, every derogatory expression, and people began to actively share it on social media, creating a powerful hashtag that surrounded the scandal. Racism and the police, stop being silent. Read the caption, which raised a wave of indignation. The comments continued to pour in, and soon the public was demanding not only an apology, but also harsher consequences for those involved in the attack. The Sun knew this was just the beginning. He used every ounce of anger to prove that he and his mother were not alone. The excitement around the story grew, and his lawyers worked to file a lawsuit against the police. Every derogatory comment from the police became a drop in the ocean of discontent, causing people to become even more outraged. Soon, people began to gather at protests demanding justice not only for his mother, but for everyone who had suffered under the system. It was a movement, and his mother became the face of the fight against racism and violence that affected the lives of many. Each new day brought new videos, new reports, and new discussions, and with each day the mounting tension grew more intense. The Sun knew his fight had only just begun. As public discontent grew, the police began to lose their position. Their actions and words, previously unpunished, were now laid bare in the face of widespread criticism. Every insult uttered against a woman was recorded and shared, causing a wave of indignation. Soon, the officers were met with widespread hatred. Their names began appearing in the news, and videos of their derogatory comments about the woman were shared on social media. Their family members faced public shaming, and many began losing their jobs in the face of shame and embarrassment. Activist groups and human rights defenders began protesting outside police stations, demanding an immediate investigation and the dismissal of those responsible. The police, realizing that their reputations had been destroyed, began to panic. One officer, who had lost his job, turned to his colleagues in despair. "Do you understand that we have lost everything? It's all because of this old fool." Another, with a bitter laugh, said, "Who is she? She's just a burden on society. She's not even worth our efforts to pay attention to her." But their arrogance began to sound less and less confident. Every time they remembered what had happened, an inner voice would ring in their heads, nagging them. People who had once been indifferent were now against them, and no matter how hard they tried to hide their true feelings, racism and hatred began to surface. One of the officers, feeling the pressure growing, tried to justify himself to his family. "I did everything I had to do to protect the order. She's just an old woman who doesn't know how to behave. Who's going to stand up for her? No one wants to see people like her on the street." But his words only increased the tension within his family. His wife, looking at his sullen face, said, "Do you understand that you are now only a disgrace to us? You have become a symbol of hatred and cruelty. How could you stoop to this?" The police began to realize that they were up against an opponent who would not stop, and it was a heavy blow to their complacency. They felt vulnerable. Their lives seemed to be falling apart before their eyes. Every time someone mentioned their names, there was hostility and judgment in the air. Then one of them, trying to restore at least a bit of respect, said, "Let's just pretend it didn't happen. We'll continue doing our jobs and everyone will forget about it. It's just noise that will quickly die down." But it wasn't that simple. With each passing week, the protests grew larger, with activists using every resource at their disposal to expose police brutality and bias. Numerous organizations began campaigning against police racism, linking their names to the protests and publishing news stories of misconduct. "Your life is a disgrace, and no one will feel sorry for you," the activists continued to insist, standing outside the police stations. "We know who you are, and this will not go without consequences." The police began to realize that simply ignoring the situation would no longer work. Their racism, initially disguised as keeping order, became an open sign of their weakness. Every derogatory comment, every word spoken toward the woman, came back to haunt them, and they could not escape it. The Sun, knowing that these police officers would not stop or change their nature, gathered activists to push the case even further. He understood that this was not just a fight for justice for his mother, but a battle against a system that systematically punishes the innocent. The image of the police, originally associated with protection, was now becoming an image of cruelty and hatred. Every day, as he looked at his mother, who was suffering humiliation and pain, he knew that his fight had only just begun. Like lightning, he knew that the light of truth was ready to illuminate this darkness, and he was not going to stop. An investigation launched in response to growing discontent soon revealed shocking facts. It turned out that the incident with the elderly woman was far from the first case of brutality by these officers. Stories of other victims began to appear in the media, and soon their voices became part of a larger picture that could not be ignored. Each new victim who came forward added their suffering to the already pent-up anger of society. One woman who faced the same police methods was recorded on video, and she, with tears in her eyes, told how they tried to detain her for no apparent reason. "They said I looked suspicious, just because I was walking down the street at night," she said, recalling being pushed to the ground while her cries for help were ignored. "I couldn't believe that something like that was possible in our city. They humiliated me, as if I wasn't human." People began sharing their stories, and soon it became clear that a system in which brutality, racism, and bias were the norm was in place. Police officers who had believed they could act with impunity began to feel the ground slipping out from under them, but they weren't about to give up. When the public began to condemn the officers' actions, the police tried to cover up the matter, claiming that the incidents were misunderstandings and that the victims themselves were exaggerating their experiences. They tried to assure everyone that these are just isolated incidents and you can't judge the entire police force by the actions of a few. One of the officers, under pressure from his colleagues, said again, "We all know that people like her will always make a fuss, as if they have the right to tell us how to work. These old women don't understand that we protect society from people like them." But such comments only fueled the hatred. In response, activists launched a campaign under the hashtag, where anyone could share their stories of police brutality. With each new post, support for the victims grew, and soon the movement spread across the city. The woman's son, realizing that this was the only way to achieve justice, actively used social networks to spread information about his like-minded people and victims. He recorded video messages in which he emphasized, "This is not just my mother's story. These are the voices of everyone who has ever experienced humiliation and violence from the police. We cannot leave this unanswered." Such actions attracted media attention, and soon all the major newspapers were reporting on the case. The police, once confident of their impunity, were now under increasing public pressure, but instead of admitting their mistakes, they continued to deny their actions, looking for excuses. At the same time, videos appeared on the internet showing officers clearly showing no respect for the victims. In one such video, one of the officers laughed and said to the camera, "I don't give a damn about these stories. Big deal. An old granny with her problems. If she can't take care of herself, why does society need her?" Each such statement caused a new wave of indignation and outrage. However, despite the police's desperate attempts to hush up the case, it was too late. Public opinion had already changed, and protests were growing. People were demanding justice not only for the elderly woman, but for everyone who had ever suffered from police brutality. The son, confident that the fight was not over, continued to draw attention to his mother's story and all the victims, knowing that each new story was another step toward justice. Soon, his efforts became part of something bigger than he could have imagined, and he knew that the fight would continue. The son, fully aware of the scale of the problem, was not content to stop at destroying the careers of individual officers. He took it upon himself to expose the deep problems of the entire police system. His voice became a symbol of the fight for reform, and he used his mother's case as a starting point for large-scale change. Each new day brought new opportunities to spread awareness about how systemic racism and bias permeate law enforcement. He organized meetings with victims of police brutality, where they could share their stories and support each other. His goal was to make this a grassroots movement, uniting people who had suffered police misconduct. On social media, he launched new campaigns, using hashtags like #PoliceReform and #MoreThanJustHistory to draw attention to his initiatives. He began collecting signatures for a petition calling for an independent investigation into all police violence and a review of the rules on the use of force. Every day he published new posts in which he spoke openly about what was happening to his mother. He spoke about how she was humiliated and insulted. They called her slow cargo as if her life didn't matter. They didn't see her as a person. They only saw her background. These police officers aren't protectors. They're rapists in uniform. Like a thunderclap, his words resonated with those who had also suffered humiliation at the hands of law enforcement. People began taking to the streets to support his campaigns. Massive protests swept the city, and they soon became part of a larger movement for civil rights and police reform across the country. At every protest, signs could be seen reading "Justice for his mother's name" and "No to Racism in Policing." Officers who had previously felt confident on the streets now walked out of their stations with uncertainty and fear. Their arrogance was beginning to crumble, and they realized that their previous actions would no longer go unpunished. One of the police officers, trying to justify himself on video, said, "That old fool did nothing but interfere with our work. I don't regret my actions. She was just an unnecessary element." But now those words sounded like a curse. The whole country had seen him humiliate an elderly woman, and no amount of justification could change public opinion. The Sun began working with human rights groups to organize roundtables to discuss needed changes in policing, bringing together experts, activists, and victims to develop strategies to prevent similar incidents in the future. Each step he took became part of a larger conversation about the need to reform the police service. He raised questions about how the country's police forces had for too long neglected the basic rights of citizens, especially those without support. Each time he spoke about his mother, about her pain and suffering, his voice became more powerful and persuasive. Yet despite all his efforts, the trauma and humiliation his mother had endured remained vivid in his mind. Her fear, her tears, her submission under the police pressure, all of it left deep wounds in his heart. He could not forget how those officers had shamelessly abused her, how they had not seen her as a human being, only an object for their violence. With each new testimony of brutality, the police began to isolate themselves from the community. People began to realize that these slurs and racist comments were not just isolated incidents, but a manifestation of deep-rooted systemic racism that needed to be eradicated. The Sun knew his fight would be long, but he was ready for it. He was ready to fight not only for his mother, but for all those who had suffered under the oppression of the system that was supposed to protect them. Every step he took, every voice he raised, was a step towards a bright future where no one would be humiliated or insulted just because of their origin. As the woman recovered from the horrific incident, she slowly began to realize that her story had acquired enormous power and meaning. Every day spent in physical therapy was not just a battle to overcome her injuries, but an internal battle to overcome the humiliation and pain she had endured. Even though it was hard for her to get out of bed, she knew she had to do it not only for herself, but for all those who, like her, had faced police brutality. Every step was a step toward restoring her dignity, which had been mercilessly trampled. But the dark memories of the police insulting her, calling her a dark stain on our society, continued to haunt her. She would often close her eyes and see them laughing, hear them repeating, "That old corgi isn't worth our time. Why waste our energy on the likes of her?" These words, full of contempt and racism, continued to torment her mind. But as she struggled with the physical pain, she realized that her suffering could be the beginning of change. Her story, full of tragedy and injustice, became a symbol of the fight against racism and police brutality. Her son, seeing her recovery, became increasingly inspired by her strength. He began actively involving her in community events where she could share her story. Every time she took the stage, her heart pounded, but she knew her voice mattered. "I was just an old woman," she began. "I didn't deserve what happened to me. They called me a burden on society. But who's the real burden? It's not me. It's those who hurt others." Her words resonated with many, and she soon became the face of resistance to injustice. She campaigned for justice and reform, and her story reached thousands of people, many of whom had never considered what victims of police brutality face. While she was on the road to recovery, not everyone was ready to accept her vision. The police officers who had once wronged her began to feel the public opinion turning against them. Their derogatory comments and racist remarks became public, and many were not shy about speaking out about what was happening. "That old woman just wants attention. She's not valuable," they continued to whisper in their circles, not realizing that their words were only increasing the anger and discord. However, every derogatory comment only strengthened her resolve. She knew that her story was not just a personal tragedy, but the experience of many. She continued to gather people around her, inspiring them to fight for their rights. Her physical injuries were slowly healing, but her soul was raw. Every time she heard someone else say that she should know her place, her heart would ache. Her mother had always told her that she should be humble and quiet, but now she realized that silence was not a choice. She had to be a voice for those who could not speak. A fire would light up in her eyes when she spoke at rallies, and she would often repeat, "We will not allow ourselves to be humiliated. We will not remain silent. I am not a burden. I am a human being, and my life matters." The woman became a symbol of the fight against police brutality, and her name became known in the civil rights movement. But even in this new status, she faced constant insults and racist comments. Her opponents tried to intimidate her, saying that she was a disturbance and that she should stay home. "You're just an old woman. Why are you even getting involved in these things?" they continued. "Do you really think your life is more important than the lives of normal people?" Every derogatory word felt like a stab in her heart, but she kept going. She knew her story was an important part of the fight for rights. Every time she shared her experiences, she saw people who were like her start to stand up and speak out. Their voices, united, became more powerful than ever before. The woman who had once been broken was now becoming a symbol of hope and resistance. She understood that even if her own wounds would never fully heal, her fight could change the lives of others. There was a determination burning in the woman's heart. She would not allow her humiliation to become silence. She would speak until her story was heard, and until people understood that behind every statistic there were real lives. And she knew her work was just beginning. The story of the woman and her son began to slowly but surely change the way society views police brutality and racism. Each new step they took broke the silence that had long shrouded the issue. The incident with the elderly woman became not just an isolated incident, but a symbol of the systemic oppression that many people experience. The son, determined to change the situation, increasingly became the face of the social movement. He organized press conferences where he shared his personal experiences and called for reforms. Every step he took drew attention to what was happening in society. At one event, he exclaimed, "My mother is not just a random victim. She is the voice of all who have been oppressed by the system that is supposed to protect us." Meanwhile, in response to growing discontent, the police tried to justify their actions, but this only increased public anger. As before, officers continued to humiliate the woman who had now become a symbol of the struggle. "Big deal, old granny," they said with disdain. "Why should we listen to her complaints? She's of no value." These words, spoken with a cheeky laugh, reflected all the prejudice that many had encountered. But the more they spoke, the stronger became the determination of the son and the woman herself. Soon, thanks to their efforts, a series of public hearings on police abuses were initiated. The son proudly spoke to many, pointing out the systemic problems. "We need to rethink the way law enforcement works. We can't allow people like them to continue to humiliate us." His words were so compelling that they began to influence people's minds. Gradually, a wider audience began to realize that racism and police brutality were not just abstract concepts, but real problems that affected people's lives. However, the police still had their supporters who, despite the facts, continued to defend their actions. "It's her own fault," they heard from police supporters. "Do you really think we don't see what she looks like? Someone had to stop her." And we did. Comments like these only fueled the hatred. The woman, though recovered, still felt the weight of those who could not speak on her shoulders. She understood that her personal story was now part of a larger struggle. As public outcry began to escalate, police attempted to hush up the case, claiming the incident was unfounded. But more and more people, inspired by the woman and her son, began taking to the streets to demand change. "We cannot allow ourselves to be deceived again," said one protester. "These police officers must be held accountable for their actions." Those gathered began to realize that incidents like these were happening everywhere and could no longer be ignored. The woman's son became the catalyst that forced the system to rethink its methods. Each protest became more and more widespread, and soon political figures began to pay attention to them. They talked about the need to reform the police, about the importance of building a dialogue between law enforcement and society. However, the police, realizing that their actions had become a subject of discussion, continued to make derogatory comments about the woman. She wants to be pitied, but we know who she really is. She's just old and useless, they said, not realizing that these words only emphasized their own hatred. However, the incident served as a catalyst for change in the justice system. Community groups began calling for new standards to prevent further police brutality. Awareness-raising workshops on racism and law enforcement began. The woman's son felt that his efforts were bearing fruit, and he persevered in his fight for his mother and for all those who had faced similar injustice. He began collecting stories of other victims to show that his mother was not alone. "We must tell these stories so that the world can see the real picture," he declared at rallies, inspiring people to share their experiences. With each new story, each new outburst from his mother, public pressure on the police increased. But despite the positive changes, hatred remained in the dark corners. The police tried to ignore and downplay the power of this movement, while continuing to spew their racist comments and insults. "This is all just a show to attract attention," they said. "These victims are just looking for a way to simplify their lives." But all these attempts only added fuel to the fire. Society began to realize that such comments were not just words, but a mentality that needed to be eradicated. The son and his mother continued to fight, knowing that their story was changing the way people viewed police brutality and racism, but their journey was just beginning. While some continued to insult and humiliate, others raised their voices for truth and justice, and this struggle for the right to be heard continued to gain strength, turning into a powerful movement for change. The events surrounding the incident with the elderly woman began to gain incredible resonance. Local media, picking up on the wave of indignation, began publishing articles about the incident, drawing attention not only to police brutality, but also to the racism that permeates the entire system. A storm arose on social networks. Many users actively expressed their indignation, demanding justice and punishment for the aggressive officers. However, among the many angry comments, defenders of the police soon began to appear. Their words were full of contempt and indifference. "It's her own fault that she got into the situation. How could she call the police if she couldn't protect herself?" they wrote. These comments only fueled the anger of activists, who argued time and time again that racism and bias are an integral part of the system. At this time, a journalist working for a local TV channel decided to interview the woman's son. She persistently asked questions, leading to his feelings and experiences. He, feeling fury and a desire to convey the truth to everyone, answered with passion, "My mother is not a criminal, she is a victim of a system that has turned us into targets simply because of how we look and where we come from." His voice was loud, and his words pierced the veil of invisibility that shrouded such cases. With each word he spoke, more and more people began to pay attention to his speech. The video of the interview quickly gained popularity, spreading across the internet like wildfire. He spoke about how his mother, being disabled, had to face such humiliation and violence. His son's words became a powerful manifesto against racism and police brutality. "They think they can humiliate her because she's old and defenseless. They only see the cargo, not the person," he blurted out, feeling the anger rising in his chest. In response, a debate erupted on social media that exposed deep divisions in society. Some supported his words, while others continued to defend the police. Cries that she doesn't deserve sympathy and the police are doing their job echoed with the same fury as those defending his mother. It only underscored how deeply ingrained racist stereotypes are in society. Meanwhile, commentators began appearing under the video of his interview, further humiliating the woman. They wrote, "She's just a burden to society. No use, only problems. Why should she go outside at all? Let her stay at home and not create unnecessary problems." Each new insult only spurred on the activists, who were not about to accept it. The woman's son continued to speak out, his rage growing more passionate, his words more comprehensive. "We will not remain silent. We will talk about how these police officers mock us, how they think they can humiliate us with impunity just because of the color of our skin and age." His words resonated with many, but also attracted the attention of opponents who began to insist that it was precisely such incidents that supported aggressive behavior on the part of the police. Their hatred became more and more obvious when they began to reproach their son for airing dirty laundry in public. The journalist, sensing the intensity of the emotions, decided to continue the interview, but the son was in no mood to give in. He raised his voice when the police again began to defend their actions. "They are not defending the law, they are defending their prejudices," My mother deserves respect, and I will not allow you to humiliate her further." With each word he spoke, more people joined the conversation. The video, which had gone viral, was widely shared on social media, creating a wave of support for his mother, showing that they were not alone. But amidst this movement, racist comments continued to be heard, building on the humiliation. Each new day brought new challenges, and each new comment intensified the fight for justice. The woman's son knew they had to continue, despite the hostility and hatred that surrounded them. Their story was becoming a symbol of hope for many, and he was determined to continue the fight for his mother, even if the world around them continued to spin in its usual cycle of hatred and prejudice. The woman's son, determined to make a difference, begins actively seeking out like-minded people to join forces against police brutality and racism. He visits local community centers where activists and human rights defenders meet. There he meets people who have experienced similar traumas, and their stories touch him deeply. At one of the first meetings, he gives a speech in which he shares his mother's experience. His words, full of pain and bitterness, evoke a powerful response among those present. "We are not alone," he says, looking at the crowd. "Every story that is told here is further proof that our system does not work. They humiliate us, thinking that they can do it with impunity." In response, voices of support rise up, and soon they begin to share their own horrific experiences. One by one, people tell of how they have faced police aggression, how they have been humiliated and insulted simply because of their race or ethnicity. The stories range from mistreatment to outright violence. Each new story highlights the deep problem that minorities face in their society. At one meeting, when one of the women tells of how she was arrested in a store because she looked suspicious, there are whispers and angry comments. "She just doesn't know how to behave. That's why she got caught," says someone from the crowd. The woman's son tries to remain calm, but he feels his inner anger flaring up. He knows he needs to take action to show everyone that this attitude is unacceptable. Inspired by the stories of others, he begins organizing rallies and protests. Together with new allies, they develop strategies to draw media and public attention to the systemic problems that minorities face. They create posters with slogans demanding justice and respect for the lives of all people, regardless of their skin color. "We must make their fear our weapon," he declares at one of the meetings. "We must show that we are not afraid of their threats." But at every rally where they speak out for their rights, there are opponents who are ready to insult and humiliate them. Racist comments are heard more and more often. All these activists know how to do is complain. They should work instead of putting on a show. Who are they to demand anything from us? A burden on society. With each new protest, the aggression and hatred only grew. Opponents formed their own groups to insult and persecute those who stood for justice. The woman's son saw how this pressure affected his allies and understood that they needed to be strong and united to overcome it. The tension reached its peak when, at one of their meetings, they decided that it was time for a major demonstration. It was supposed to be a peaceful protest, but there was tension in the air and everyone knew that not everyone could remain calm. The woman's son addressed the crowd. "We must unite to show that we are greater than their hatred. They may try to break us, but we will stand together." This statement elicits a loud round of applause and the atmosphere in the room becomes tense. They discuss the importance of preparing for possible confrontations and how to protect themselves and each other. However, even among the supporters, there are those who still have doubts. Some are afraid of the consequences, while others are beginning to feel pressure from their circles who do not support the movement. Comments about the undesirability of the struggle and the uselessness of protests ring in their ears. "If she were normal, she wouldn't be in this situation," says one of the meeting participants, hinting at the son's mother. These derogatory words cause a storm of emotions. The son, feeling the internal tension growing, decides not to remain silent. "You don't understand. My mother is a person who deserves respect. Despite her shortcomings, it's not about what she did or didn't do. It's about how we all need to be protected." His voice is powerful and confident, and he notices how others have begun to connect with his words. With each new rally and each new story, they are more united in the fight for justice. Despite the growing pressure and hatred, they know that their voice matters, and they will continue to fight for their mother and all who suffer injustice. A woman who has experienced horrific events begins to realize that her trauma is not limited to physical injuries. Every morning, when she wakes up, She feels a weight that weighs on her soul. Nightmares of how she was humiliated and insulted do not leave her, and she realizes that she needs more than just treatment for physical injuries. She decides to seek help from a psychologist. During her first sessions, she feels awkward and vulnerable. In the doctor's office, she is overcome with fear. What if her feelings are rejected again? But as she opens up to the therapist, she begins to remember exactly how she felt when the police beat her. Every word she says becomes a cry for help, and with each session she feels a little better. I felt like my life was worthless, like I was just a burden on society, she whispers, trying to hold back tears. They looked at me like I was dirty, like I shouldn't exist. Her therapist, with understanding and compassion, helps her sort out her emotions. Over the course of sessions, she reveals her fears, how the humiliation she has endured have undermined her self-esteem. She talks about how difficult it is for her to look at herself in the mirror, how she is afraid to go out, knowing that everyone might judge her. They all think I deserve it, she says, lamenting. I heard someone say, let him stay home and not cause trouble. It cuts me to the core. These sessions become not only part of her healing, but also a source of inspiration. After each visit to the psychologist, she feels a little more confident, and soon decides to share her experience at meetings with other activists. I want everyone to know that what happened to me doesn't define who I am, she says at one of the meetings. I want others not to experience the same fear and humiliation that I experience. However, even as she tries to inspire others, she continues to be the target of abuse. Hateful and contemptuous comments appear online and at rallies. She just wants to be a victim, they write on social networks. She'd be better off not leaving the house if she doesn't want trouble. Who is she to talk about justice? Let her just live her worthless life, not bothering normal people. These derogatory words and attacks continue to torment her. The woman experiences fear and doubt again, but then she remembers her sessions with a psychologist and everything she learned. She remembers how important it is to continue to fight, even when the world around her is full of hatred. With each new story she tells at meetings, she feels more and more that her experience is important. She becomes a symbol of hope for many who have faced similar experiences. Participants begin to approach her, sharing their stories and finding support in her. But amid this support comes racist insults that undermine her confidence. She just wants attention. Someone from the crowd says, let her just forget about it and move on with her life, without any rallies. These words, though painful, only strengthen her resolve. She knows she can't let them break her spirit. Every time she encounters bias, she reminds herself that her story matters and that she is not alone. And while her journey to healing is far from over, she is beginning to believe that her experience can be a source of strength for others, and she is determined to continue to speak out about what happened to her to make a difference. She knows that despite the trauma she carries with her, she can be a voice for those who cannot speak out and continue to fight for the justice she so desperately needs. As the activists began to gain popularity, the public outcry surrounding their movement did not go unnoticed. The police, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, decided to act more aggressively. On one warm evening, when hundreds of people gathered for a rally, the atmosphere was filled with determination and hope. The woman's son stood on the stage, his voice confident as he addressed the crowd. We are here to show that we will not tolerate violence and bias. We demand justice. The crowd greeted his words with thunderous applause, but there were those in the crowd who did not share his views. As he continued speaking, police moved in to intervene. Before he could finish his speech, one of the police officers, noticing several provocateurs in the crowd, began to give orders. As if winking at each other, the officers began to make their way through the crowd, insisting that the activists disperse. Get out of here, you don't belong on the street, one of the policemen shouted, showing his contempt. Some participants began shouting outraged responses, raising the tension. Soon conflicts broke out. Several young people, burned out by the policeman's words, began pushing and hurling insults at them. You think you can just disperse us? You're just a group of racists in uniform, one of the activists shouted, pointing at the officers. The woman's son, watching the growing panic, tried to remain calm. His voice sounded again, please, do not give in to provocations. We are here to peacefully assert our rights. But his words, unfortunately, did not always reach the ears. The crowd grew restless, and some activists, enraged by the police's bias, began to respond to provocations. "These heartless bastards don't understand anything," screamed one of the women who recently shared her story of a run-in with the police, her eyes shining with anger. "They can't hear us as long as we sit quietly," the young man added, throwing objects towards the police. The woman's son tried again to restore order, but tensions grew and soon both sides flared up. Police, ready to use force, raised their shields, and when activists began to protest, violence erupted on both sides. "Get your hands off me," one of the activists screamed as a police officer grabbed her wrist. There were shouts and sounds of fighting. The crowd grew larger and the atmosphere became more and more hostile. In the background of all this, there was a discussion about racism and bias. Someone from the crowd shouted, "They think that we are animals, that we can be intimidated. They only prove that all their words are lies." The problem only worsened when police began to insult the activists, openly showing contempt. "You are just a bunch of lunatics who only want to destroy," one of the officers shouted, pointing at the protesters with disdain. "Go back to your problems," another added, smirking, as if the very presence of activists on the street was something low and derogatory. Despite the words that were spoken on both sides, the tension continued to mount. The woman's son, seeing his comrades losing control, took the initiative and began to fight for a peaceful outcome. "We are here to claim our rights. We must not give in to violence," he shouted, trying to reorient the crowd to a more peaceful approach. But his efforts seemed futile. The activists began to build up anger, and the police aggression only added fuel to the fire. Shouts of abuse, racist comments, and insults resurfaced, adding to the general anger and frustration. Every insult, every put-down, every shout only served to highlight how deep the divisions in society were. The crowd was divided between those who wanted change and those who defended the status quo. The woman, watching all this, felt her heart break for those who were also suffering. Her son was on the front lines of this struggle, but even he knew that a peaceful demonstration could turn into chaos if the situation did not change. At that moment, doubts crept into her heart. How long could they fight against a system that denied them their right to life and dignity? But one thing was clear: as long as they continued to fight, their voices would not be silenced. They could not give up, even when they were faced with threats and hatred. The woman's son, who had become a symbol of the fight for justice, began to feel the pressure. Every day, society's expectations became a heavier burden. His mind was constantly spinning about how important his role was to this movement, and every mistake could lead to catastrophic consequences. The fear of losing his mother, who now represented everything they stood for, pushed him to think that he was not up to the task. At night, when silence fell over the city, he relived the events that had happened to his mother. Memories of her being humiliated and insulted tormented his mind. He remembered her standing, scared and helpless, in front of police officers who did not consider her human. Her face, full of fear, became a constant ghost in his mind. "Maybe I shouldn't interfere so much," he thought, doubting his own powers. "I'm only putting her in danger. Maybe it's better to just leave things as they are and not take risks." But memories of his difficult past, of his own experiences with bias and injustice, were haunting him. He remembered being arrested on false charges as a young man. The difficult times he had to survive in a system that only seemed to squeeze him. These moments gave him strength, but they also left him sad. When questions about his reliability appeared on the horizon, he suddenly felt lost and weak. But in the darkness and doubts of the night, he found support in the other participants in the movement. Each of them shared their stories, their fears, and hopes. Together, they discussed how they had experienced the same humiliations and insults that had so painfully affected his mother. One day, when they were gathered at the community center, someone said, "We must remember why we are here. It is not just about your mother, it is about all of us. We are all suffering from this system, from the bias that consumes us." His words resonated with others. They remembered how they themselves had been humiliated when they were simply trying to live their lives. One participant, with a strong spirit, raised her hand and said, "We can't let these police officers and everyone who supports them break us. We must fight not only for her, but for everyone who suffers at their hands." The words became a mantra of sorts, encouraging them. They banded together to support each other, and soon the son felt he was not alone. His brothers and sisters in the struggle became his rock during this difficult time. However, derogatory comments and racist insults towards his mother continued to be made online, adding extra pressure to his shoulders. "She's just an old woman who doesn't understand how this world works," they wrote in the comments. "Let her go back to her useless life. No rallies will help people like her. The system will not change, and her son knows it." Each new insult reverberated in his soul, like a blow to his resolve. But his support and like-minded people helped him not to break. Together they discussed strategies for how to respond to hatred, and he realized that he could not stop. As he grew stronger, he began to take an active role in organizing meetings and protests. He realized that his mother was not only a symbol of pain and fear, but also an embodiment of hope and the fight for justice. He and other activists organized several events to educate the public about police brutality and racism. With each rally and gathering, he found new strength to continue despite the difficulties. He promised himself that he would not let hatred consume him and that his mother, despite all the suffering, would be proud of him. The understanding grew in his heart that their fight was not only a fight for her honor, but also for the changes in society that were so necessary. And with each step, he became more and more convinced that they could make the world a better place, despite all the obstacles that stood in their way. The police began using intimidation tactics when their actions came under public scrutiny. The woman began receiving threats. Hateful comments on social media were just the tip of the iceberg. Threatening notes appeared on her door, and sometimes even offensive messages suggesting that she should shut up and go back to her country. The son felt a chill run down his spine when he saw this. His fear for the safety of his mother and family became unbearable. Every time he looked at her, his heart sank with worry. They were not just targets, they were victims of a system that was supposed to protect them, but instead was only increasing their fear. "We can't be defenseless," he told a gathering of activists, his voice shaking with tension. "They won't stop until they get what they want. We need a lawyer, someone who can protect us and help us in this fight. We are not alone." The meeting was full of like-minded people, each of whom understood how dangerous and threatening their situation had become. They decided that it was necessary to provide protection for all who stood for justice. Gathering in a small community center, they began to formulate a plan. The son led the discussion, his words full of determination and fighting spirit. Together, they developed a strategy that included not only legal defense but also an information campaign to raise awareness of the violence his mother had endured. "We must be strong," he said, looking at his brothers and sisters in the struggle. "We will not let them intimidate us. Every threat, every sign on the door is only confirmation that we are right in our desire to fight this injustice." Meanwhile, the police, feeling they were losing control of the situation, stepped up their intimidation efforts. In response to their activity, they increased their racial slurs against the woman. "Let that old black woman know her place," they shouted at rallies, confident of their impunity. The woman, hearing such words, felt her self-esteem continue to crumble. The threats she received were not only physical, they were emotional and psychological. Each insult directed at her echoed in her soul, undermining her confidence. But despite this, she tried to hold on, understanding that her son and the activists needed her strength and resilience. Amid this struggle, the son continued to look for ways to protect his mother and make her feel safe. He knew they had to be prepared for anything. The lawyer they hired became more than just a lawyer. He became a symbol of their resolve to fight. "We will work together," the lawyer said, squeezing the woman's hand. "I will do everything I can to protect you and your family. We will win." This was the beginning of a new phase in their struggle. The woman, although traumatized, found the strength to talk about her experiences, sharing them at meetings. Every word she said became a step toward healing, both for her and for others who suffered under the system that oppressed them. While the police continued to intimidate and humiliate, they did not know that their tactics were only strengthening the resolve of those they were trying to break. Every rally and every gathering strengthened the spirit of the activists, and they realized that together they could withstand any threat. Gathering for the last time before the big protests, they took a step back to look at what they had achieved, despite all the humiliation and racist abuse. "We are together, and that is our strength," the son said as everyone raised their hands in a sign of unity. We will not let anyone silence us. The woman's story began to spread not only locally but also beyond. New articles and reports flooded the internet, and soon her name was known in major cities across the country. Amid this widespread coverage, rallies in her support took place, where people gathered to protest police brutality and racism. It became a true movement of solidarity, but also an increase in hatred. Along with the support came aggression. The comments on social media became increasingly vicious. Why should we listen to this black old woman? She just wants attention. Or her son is a common criminal. That's all we need to know. These insults did not go unnoticed. The son, reading them, felt his anger boiling. Every word directed at his mother echoed in his soul like a hammer blow on glass. However, public support only grew. Politicians began to respond to the outrage and activism of citizens. Discussions about police reforms began in the government. All this led to the woman being invited to speak at one of these events. It was her chance to speak about her suffering, and she understood how important it was. When the day came to speak, her heart was pounding with excitement. She knew she had to share her truth. On stage in front of a crowd of people, including journalists and government officials, she opened her mouth and began to tell her story. Her voice was confident, but behind it was a pain that was tearing her apart from the inside. "I'm not just a victim," she said, looking into the eyes of her audience. "I'm a mother, a grandmother, a woman who has endured horror and humiliation simply because of her ethnicity. They thought they could get away with us, but I'm here to say, it won't happen." Her words evoked strong emotions in those present. Tears streamed down some cheeks, while others hugged their neighbors. It became a catalyst for the passage of bills aimed at reforming the police. But amid this triumph, insults continued to be heard. Words of hatred were whispered around her. "Look at this old woman. She has no right to talk about justice. Or she just wants easy money at this rally." The woman felt her heart pricking at these words, but she did not allow them to break her. Instead, she continued speaking, her voice growing louder and more determined. "I don't want this to happen to anyone else. No one should feel insecure because of the color of their skin. This isn't just my fight. It's each of us' fight." With each word she spoke, the excitement in the hall grew. The politicians present at the event began to exchange glances. Their faces showed that they understood the full weight of her words. But among all the applause and support, voices of hatred were still heard. Someone from the hall shouted, "You're just ashamed of your race. It's all for attention." The cry caused a wave of indignation among the supporters. The woman's son stood up, his face burning with anger, but before he could respond, his mother put her hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Don't pay attention, we're here to tell the truth." Her presence and strength became an example for many. She knew that her fight was not only a personal story, but also a symbol for many who suffered from bias and injustice. Her speech was an impetus for real change, and her voice will undoubtedly be part of the fight for justice. The rally was not just an event, it was a movement. Each of them understood that they could not allow the system to continue to oppress people. Each of them was ready to fight, despite the humiliation and racism they saw around them. The woman standing on the stage not only took a step forward in her fight, but also inspired millions of others, raising the banner of hope for a better future. And while the hate continued to be heard, her story became a symbol of the fight against prejudice and injustice that still exists in society. The woman continued to speak out, sharing her story with anyone who would listen. Rallies and protests swept the country, and soon their voices united into a powerful movement demanding change. Politicians, under public pressure, began to pass laws aimed at reforming the police, but the hatred from those who did not want change only grew. The police, who initially felt unthreatening, began to realize that their actions had become public, but instead of repenting, they decided to act even more aggressively. In an effort to suppress the movement, they launched investigations against activists, including the woman's son, portraying him as a criminal and provocateur. However, the activists had their own strength. They did not give up. The woman's son, deciding it was his time to act, used his connections and resources to expose the police. He collected all the evidence of the officers' misconduct, including videos showing them humiliating his mother and other victims. These recordings became the basis for a new investigation, which was launched at the government level. Unfortunately, the police, unwilling to give in, made a fatal mistake. In an attempt to intimidate the activists, they violently dispersed a peaceful rally, which caused a huge public outcry. a video of their brutality went viral. The officers, who thought they were untouchable, suddenly found themselves in the spotlight and were met with a wave of anger and condemnation. The woman's son and other activists turned to human rights organizations, and the police violence case was investigated at the federal level. Their persistence led to prosecutors pursuing criminal charges against the officers. It gradually became clear that these officers not only had a history of violence, but also ties to criminal gangs, which only added fuel to the fire. The situation for the police grew worse with each passing day. Like a mosaic, all their crimes came together: racial slurs, illegal arrests, intimidation, and brutality. As a result, their faces became known throughout the country not as defenders of order, but as symbols of systemic violence. At the trial of these police officers, the woman gave an emotional speech. She spoke of her suffering, how she was humiliated, how she was treated, and how her life had changed. The words she spoke were remembered by many. "This is not just my story. This is the story of everyone who has experienced injustice. I am here to say, enough. We will not remain silent any longer." The trial was a major event, with crowds coming out to support the woman and her son. Ultimately, after a long trial and much testimony, the police officers were found guilty. The court handed down a sentence that included significant prison terms, community service, and the loss of their gun licenses. Thus ended this sad chapter. The policemen who once thought they could abuse people with impunity found themselves in prison. Deep changes began in society, and women, as symbols of struggle, continued to inspire others not to give in to oppression. The woman recovered and found the strength to continue her fight. She understood that a real victory was not only her personal triumph, but also a step towards justice for everyone who had ever suffered at the hands of the system. The story of her struggle remained in the hearts of people, and her name became synonymous with hope and change. Despite all the humiliations, her strength and fortitude became an example for future generations. She knew that truth would always prevail, and that was the real victory. The story of a woman and her son, who became a symbol of the fight for justice, ended on a high note. Thanks to their courage, bravery, and determination, many people found hope for change in society. The events that took place not only exposed police brutality, but also opened the eyes of many to the systemic problems that vulnerable groups face. The violence they experienced became a catalyst for widespread reforms at all levels of government. Society began to change. There was a growing awareness of the need to combat bias and racism, and these changes reflected the suffering that this woman and many others had endured. The woman, having recovered from all her ordeals, became an active supporter of human rights and continued to share her story, inspiring others. She knew that her experience could change the lives of others, and each speech became an important step towards justice. The son, having gained confidence in his own strength, continued his fight, leading others who also wanted change. Their story became not only a symbol of resistance to violence, but also a hope for future generations who could live in a world free of fear and hatred. Thus ended the chapter, but the fight for justice continued. The woman and her son became a living reminder that even in the most difficult situations, one can find the strength and courage to resist systemic oppression. Time has passed, but their story remains in the hearts of many, serving as an example of the importance of speaking the truth and fighting for what is right. And thank you for following this powerful story. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced racism in your life or witnessed such situations? Your stories and opinions are very important to us, and we value each and every one of you. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel and like it. Your support helps us continue to share meaningful stories. Have a wonderful day, everyone.